Has the dollar reached its sell-by date? Has its role as the world's premier reserve currency been diminished, perhaps, by the arrival of Donald Trump? Or is any reduced dependence on the greenback just a natural progression? This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. The dollar's been the currency of choice for foreign exchange reserves and bilateral trade for more than 70 years, but are countries decreasing their dependence on it? There are economists who believe that America's increasing isolation is contributing to the dollar falling out of favour. What does that mean? And others say that China's growing world dominance could even see the yuan eventually take over.
A symbol of US pride and economic dominance. But the world's choice reserve currency could be losing its luster. There's a global appetite for change.
Избыточного монополизма доллара как единственной мировой резервной валюты. Вот это точно плохо для мировой экономики. Это сделало мировую экономику несбалансированной и очень уязвимой.
Is the dollar the first casualty as the United States becomes more isolated from the rest of the world? For decades, the US currency has been the standard in global trade. But the BRICS alliance is championing change. Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa are seeking to reorder global priorities. Russia and China are pushing to conduct their trade in yuan and rubles. Global reliance on dollars has made US sanctions more punishing. Venezuela is a country bordering on default and is looking to Russia and China for economic support.
Nuestro pueblo ha sido sabio. Nuestro pueblo le ha dado un mensaje brutal al gobierno imperialista de Donald Trump.
Venezuela is no longer accepting dollars for its oil. The oil trade fortifies the dollar as a global currency. And China is the world's largest importer, but still pays in the US currency, a fact that could put pressure on the world's largest exporter, Saudi Arabia. If the Saudis start trading in yuan, the rest of OPEC is likely to follow. Dollars have been the backbone of economic security for decades, a fact that won't change overnight. But if US influence wanes further, so too could its currency.
Delighted to say that at the round table today we have Yuan, head of China Foresight at the London School of Economics, the LSE. We have Sandy Brown Hager, global economics specialist at City University of London. To my left we have Abrams, analyst for the market Mogul, also here. Damian Sweeney, the founder of the Pure Asset Company Limited, who loves gold, and we'll talk about that, Damian, in just a little while. But let me kick off with this one. Talk you first of all. Why would anybody in the street really have to care about this?
Very good question. So, in essence, de-dollarization and the movement away from the US dollar is something that's been speculated about for some time. It's something that hasn't truly happened as of yet. In terms of how it will affect people day to day, it could be from everything. If you consider the dollar's been the world reserve currency since the end of World War II, we're really looking at things from oil production, how people consume petrol, how you buy day-to-day goods and services, the exchange rates fluctuations and interest rates across various countries, continents.
My food bill might go up.
Food bill might go up.
Might go down.
Might go down. It's one of those things that we can't really foresee exactly what's going to happen as an outcome of it. All we know is it's going to be a cataclysmic change from where we've been.
So, you three, I mean, does this matter to every man, jack of us, worldwide?
Well, every bit of trade on the planet is based on the dollar in terms of a reserve currency. Now, there is movement away from that, and if that's the case, then people need to take note, because it will have ramifications in pricing, in influence, and ultimately in politics. Politics has a knock-on effect, and vice versa with the US dollar. So people do need to, to be aware, because wealth is another factor that will be affected. Yeah. In terms of, at the end of the day, currency is supposed to be a store of value, and the dollar has been the ultimate supposed store of value over the years.
A lot of people are talking about China becoming a massive player in this, and it's playing a political game, perhaps. Does it want to be the reserve currency or just an alternative?
Well, I think China really want to be a reserve currency, as we already seen in the past few years. I mean, back to 2016 October, China joined the basket currency, part of SDR. So that's almost like a political significance for China.
So that's rather like getting a seat on the UN Security Council,
it's like
in terms of your global sort of chest puffing.
It's the exorbitant privilege China really wanted to have that status, not on a par with dollars, but almost close to that status, what China really wants.
So we've established that you believe it matters to almost everybody worldwide in some shape or form. Is it happening? Is the dollar tumbling, crumbling?
We see lots of anecdotal evidence about, countries repatriating their gold supplies, about people souring on the US dollar because of the election of Trump. But if we look at the raw aggregate data, there's been very little signs that anything actually has happened significantly so far. If you look at the currency composition of foreign exchange reserves of central banks, they have held steady. If we look at the amount of usage of dollar within foreign exchange transactions, that has held steady for the past few decades. The value of the dollar has fallen a bit over the past year, but it still remains historically very
do jump in. You don't have to wait for me to ask a question, because you all know a great deal more about this than I do. So talk amongst yourselves as well.
I certainly agree with you, because by looking at how much percentage of China's foreign reserve and in equivalence into the U.S. Treasury bond, 11% of the Chinese foreign reserves into U.S. Treasury bond. So that actually shows the significance and how much China takes seriously on the dollar issues as well. Yeah.
And if I can just add to that as well, there was a lot of talk in the lead up to the election that China would, if Trump were elected, they would just get rid of all of their treasuries altogether, because Trump had said a lot of quite rude things about China. I looked at the data last week, and China's actually increased its treasuries.
Yeah, why is it doing that?
Well, in my opinion, it's the best choice of a bad bunch, because you have the euro, which is in a bad state of affairs. The fact that the US have announced the end of quantitative easing, which is the printing of money, has all of a sudden made the dollar a bit more appealing. Although that is a temporary stop, the quantitative easing will be back. So all currencies are unbacked currently, which is a fiat-based monetary system, and it's unprecedented in world history that all currencies are fiat at the same time.
And is this why everybody... Give me a second. Is this why people are buying more gold?
Well, it is. Let's take...
we're not talking about people like us at the table. We're talking about major institutions.
Well, the central banks across the world, on the whole, are increasing their allocation to gold. That is very clear. The evidence is there. But more importantly, you mentioned there about the Chinese perspective on all this. The Chinese are the biggest miners of gold. The second is the Russians. They operate quite secretly in terms of how much they are keeping and storing in the central banks. And in addition to that, there's a big flow, and the evidence again is all there, of gold from west to east via places like Switzerland, where it's refined into kilobars and sent out to the east.
Okay, we'll talk about the significance of that. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to kind of combat the point that you both made a little bit earlier in regards to you haven't really seen much against the dollar. So I'd say while maybe the dollar is being used quite frivolously, quite heavily as it has been in the past, I would actually look to the point of Russia and China buying up so many gold reserves as a direct sort of look to combat the dollar. So essentially, if you're looking about 10 years ago, Russia had about 400 tons of gold reserves, China about 600. They're now both hovering around 1,800, so they've both gone up very significantly in the past 10 years. And the reason for that is to prevent any eventual situation where we move from a fiat currency situation, we go back to having currencies backed by gold. They're safeguarded against that. They've already kind of made the moves to say if that happens, we're already at point B.
So just help me here. If the dollar starts to crumble, we're going to see major shifts in the economic tectonic plates around the world. If you've got gold, then you're protected against that. But why would anybody want to see that happen? I mean, what is wrong with the dollar as a reserve currency?
Well, I mean, purely from geopolitical reasons, I mean, if you have too much dollars, then that means you cannot really exchange with the other currencies more freely. And the secondly is, if we have too much dollars, and how are you going to deter the countries who are unfriendly with the United States? For example, China DPRK issues, actually dollar will come into place because by having that amount of dollar, and China cannot really exchange into renminbi, and therefore cannot really exchange with North Korea as well. So it's also a geopolitical issues in here.
So the US wants to keep the dollar strong, A, because it props up its national debt, which I think is around about $20 trillion. But at the same time, it gives it that muscle because everybody has to use it. Is that the way it works?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not going to allow its own currency to crumble?
No.
How can it prevent that?
We have to look at the history, recent history, first of all. Since 1971, the dollar was unbacked by gold. That was a unilateral decision so that currencies couldn't be exchanged for gold. So now we have an unbacked currency, but it gives the United States a privilege in the world whereby it can sell, it can finance war, it can finance imports at a very low cost because the dollars are recycled into treasuries and held by the Chinese, the Russians, the Japanese, etc. So it is a privileged position, and certain countries are trying to move away from that. The evidence is all there. The Iranians have moved out of trading in dollars. They've announced that.
Venezuela was mentioned.
Venezuela have
seriously, but does a country like Venezuela actually matter in this? I know it produces a lot of oil, but it's a basket case when it comes to its economy and the muscle it has. It's
still a top 10 oil producer in the world.
Okay.
I think
so it does matter.
Sorry to interrupt.
Sandy, no, it's just a conversation. There's no interrupting.
Just to be a bit contrarian about this whole point, I think if we look at dollar hegemony and the major holders of U.S. assets, we can look at Iran and Venezuela and all these countries, but again, the numbers suggest that it's really China and Japan that are the dominant players. They hold up to 1/3 of all the foreign holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. They dominate the holding of U.S. bonds and equities, and so if we are going to see a change, I think we have to look at those main players more than any of the smaller players to see some sort of change away from.
Obviously, there's a lot of different people suggesting there's going to be a war between the United States and China, but unfortunately, I say this is very unlikely to happen because if there's going to be a war between China and the United States, that's going to be economically mutually destructive. It doesn't help anybody because of that dollar exchange rate holding.
However, if you were China, you would be in a stronger position, were you, to get into any kind of confrontation if you had delinked yourself from dollar dependence to some extent, yeah?
That is actually happening. As we speak, the Chinese have developed their own payment system to replace the SWIFT international payment system. And internally, their Union Pay system is replacing Visa and MasterCard. The Russians have done exactly the same. And now there's a discussion between the Russians and Chinese to link the two payment systems, bypassing SWIFT completely. So bit by bit, the dollar is being undermined, and people need to take note of that.
If you were in the Federal Reserve, or if you were in the White House, would you be very worried by what you were seeing?
Not very worried. I'd say at this moment in time, we're still looking at the dominance of the US in terms of how it's traded, and I think it's a fantastic point. The amount of US treasuries that China holds is very, very key. I think the concern is that China and Russia have been doing this almost from silent agreements for some time. And that's something that you do definitely need to look at and say, well, that's probably the #1 way that they're going to be able to build up the power to combat us.
But I think we seems to be overplayed this China-Russia relations. But I mean, if we're looking at trade figures, China is the #1 trade partner with Russia, but Russia is only the #17 trade partner with China. I mean, if you have only the #17, how can you expecting that many transactions happening? So I would rather say it's more a political gesture between two governments rather than real substance happening.
The United States isn't going to allow this to happen, though, really, is it?
And there's also questions about what's happening domestically within China and what would have to change in order for them to become the hegemon in terms of its own currency. They would have to move away from this export-led growth model, which has been developed since the 1990s. And there are really no indications that China wants to move away from that. I'm sure Jia can talk more about the domestic implications, but moving away from the dollar would mean a collapse in the dollar essentially, which would boost the export competitiveness of the US and harm China very much.
You see, I'm wondering whether, I mean, there was all this talk of what we refer to sometimes as de-dollarization, and how it would be accelerated when Donald Trump came to the White House. Has there been a Trump effect? Or is the dollar sort of so loud, if you like, that no matter what he was doing at this particular time, it wouldn't make any difference?
Well, I think we need to look at recent changes, because over the last 20, 30 years, there hasn't been much of a cascade of de-dollarization. It's been a very gradual process. However, it's speeded up recently. China has introduced the gold futures, sorry, the oil futures contract, which will be priced in Yuan. That could change the world fundamentally in terms of how the petrodollar is traded. And they have, you know, they're the largest importer of oil in the world, and they may dictate to others how they purchase their oil in terms of away from the dollar and into the yuan.
I'll ask you all in a moment, or is it just to consider what you think might happen in the next 10 years. But I was reading something on a news website. It happened to be Russia Today news website. And there was an economist quoted there. I think the name is irrelevant because it's clear that he has been asked to write this on behalf of the Russian station. He describes it as a tyranny of the US dollar. Has it been used that way?
Can you clarify, when he says tyranny, do you talk about
China, increasingly backed by Russia, the two great Eurasian nations are taking decisive steps to create a very viable alternative to the tyranny of the US dollar?
Sure. So what I think he's getting at there is the soft power that the US dollar holds over other nations. I think the petrodollar, and the reason why he's referring to it as a tyranny, is meant that, as we said before, the US government can pretty much, or the Federal Reserve rather, can pretty much print money at will.
Yeah.
They have full power to be able to go away and finance wars, anything along those regards. If you now switch things around and you say, okay, we're going to have multiple different currencies that we're going to use as a kind of global reserve on an equal level, the US no longer has that power to do that. So what we're really trying to do here is look at a form of equality and find a way that essentially we can meet in the middle.
It's almost like a way of saying not just China, but really a group of countries and a group of emerging market economies realize their voices in international monetary market have not been heard loud and clear. Yeah. So that's exactly that tyranny they're referring to.
And if the major oil producer in the world, Saudi Arabia, which we know is going through massive changes at the moment, starts to look in other directions, that would be extremely significant. Are we seeing signs of this? Because people were saying Crown Prince Mohammed was probably going to do that, but now they seem to be cozying up perhaps a little bit more, once again, with the US.
Yeah, that is changing. The exports of Saudi oil to the United States are a third of what they were just a matter of a few years ago. Their refineries of stockpiled oil is depleted in the States, and it's a decision that they have made, and they're looking more to the east. Now, that has fundamental ramifications, and the United States aren't happy about that. We can see that in Qatar and what's happened there. Qatar has started trading outside of the US dollar. In the last couple of years, I think it's about 86 billion worth of trade in Yuan. So
it's effectively almost impossible. Please jump in if you want to have your one hand in the petrodollar camp, and your other hand giving most of your product to somebody who would like to see the end, perhaps, of the petrodollar.
But as important as the oil obviously is to the economy, as important as Saudi Arabia is in the Middle East, like it's the largest economy in the Middle East, we have to again recognize the fact that I think they're number 12 when it comes to foreign holdings of U.S. Treasury securities. They're actually, in the grand scheme of things, a fairly minor player when we compare them against China and Japan. So I don't think on its own Saudi Arabia is going to necessarily spell the end of dollar hegemony, although that would be a huge symbolic shift if it were to switch away from.
Well, this was what I was going to ask you to consider. What signs, A, do we need to look for? Yeah. And secondly, what do you think is likely to to happen? Do you first?
I'm probably going to go to the internal domestic economic change inside China, given what has happened in Party Congress 3 weeks ago. I mean, Xi Jinping made very clear we're going to concern far less on the GDP growth. So that means less oil demand. And if we were more concerned on quality of growth, as well as the quality of the air as well. So that means renewable energy will take much long lead compared with more petrol polluted industry. So there'll be far less demand on the oil from Chinese side, I would say. So that's one of the factors could potentially impact upon in the OPEC market. Yeah.
Either so profound that nobody could answer that one, or you were waiting for me to ask a question.
No,
do just jump in.
I would say the petrodollar started with the Saudis, and as a promise for security and arms, etc., from the United States, they agreed to sell all their oil in dollars, therefore creating the petrodollar. So that's where it started, and that's where we should look for signs that it ends, because if the Saudis start trading oil in Chinese yuan, renminbi, then we all should take note.
But you believe it's going to be a gold standard again, do you? Or
I hope so.
Yeah.
Because the current system is a debt-based system which is getting out of control. There's clearly debt build up across the world which is unpayable. So how do we get out of that? By printing more debt? I don't think that's the solution.
Does China effectively say if it wants to become the preeminent reserve currency, does it say to the United States, okay, with 20 trillion? It's in global terms, in what we're going to get in the future, we just have to forget about that and just take a hit and carry on as normal. But the yuan would be the king.
Half of the US treasuries are owned internally, so you can't get mom and pop and say, sorry, your pension funds are null and void now. So it's too much at stake for that to happen. So what we have in effect done is borrow from future generations, which has to be paid back somehow, or else there's a big default, which could happen.
I share the worry about growing indebtedness, but I wonder about the feasibility of the return to a gold standard and also gold as an alternative reserve asset. I think what's the total value of the world stock of gold? It's somewhere between $7 to $8 trillion. Half of that is held in the form of jewelry. If you think of China's foreign exchange reserves are somewhere between 3 to 4 trillion outstanding as it is. That wouldn't even be enough to cover China's demand for safe assets. So a return to gold would probably mean some sort of massive deflation and slowing of growth. And yeah, I'm not sure how feasible that is in the long term.
Actually, just to follow your point regarding you said about this gold reserves, and I said something on the institutions. If you're looking at all the major economic institutions in the world, IMF, World Bank, and adding all together, the initial capital is 50 times more than AIIB and the BRIC banks. I mean, there's a new financial institutions trying to be established in the past 2 years. And so, I mean, how can China compete with that 50 times more of international economic institutions? That's a big question.
You think it's inevitable, though, don't you, Tor?
I wouldn't say inevitable. Are you saying in regards to actual movement away from
the end of the dollar?
I wouldn't say inevitable. I'd say it's something that people are pushing for more and more so. I think it's something that's becoming a lot more publicly understood, a lot more publicly known. I think the key really lies within Saudi Arabia, just to echo the sentiment. I think really it's where it began, the petrodollar. If Saudi Arabia was to consider moving to yuan, then there is a real possibility that it is something that could happen eventually. I know at this moment in time, China is pretty much Saudi Arabia's biggest customer. So if China does manage to move forwards with kind of these oil futures and put those measures in place, it is something that potentially could happen. In terms of inevitability, there's a lot of things that do need to happen.
Rather than inevitable?
Likely, yes. Within the next 5 to 10 years, no. I'd say further down the line, definitely.
We started this program by, I asked, what do you think it would mean to any ordinary person in the street? As we come to the conclusion of the program, who wants to say, will their lives be better without the dollar, or will their lives just be the same as ever with a few changes at the edges? Sandy, you're looking like that's the silliest question on earth.
Are you meaning my personal life, whether it would be better without it?
Yeah, anybody's. I don't mean complicated personal life. I mean just sort of going about your daily business.
I don't think it would have. I mean, it's very hard to see how the sort of dominoes will fall in the case of a dollar collapse and de-dollarization. I'm sure it would have profound implications, but I can't connect the dots to my own personal life necessarily.
I think it's just simply too complicated to explain, but if we're just considering how many Chinese tourists to go abroad every year and how much they spend every year, what really the currency spendings on US dollars. So every single tourist is spending around $2,000 per day in the United States. This is the Chinese tourist. So if the dollar becomes de-dollarization world, what is the replacing currency?
It's been brought up about there not being enough gold in the world to cover the financial system. Well, I would disagree with that because it's not about the physical amount in terms of tonnage. It's just the price. So if the price was right, it can cover any amount of fiat money that's available.
Thank you all very much indeed for coming on Roundtable. I don't know whether we provided any answers. There's certainly plenty of questions out there. For me, it's a little bit like the weather. You know, it's always going to be there. There are experts who say this is going to happen, but all you've got to do is take a look, and then you'll work it out for yourself. Change, it appears, is on the way. What sort of change, we'll have to wait and see. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team, thank you very much for watching. I hope to have you with us next time. For now, bye-bye.